In the early 1890s, when he was about 28 years old, Coleman Wheeler moved to Nehalem with plans to enter the logging business. Nehalem was growing fast. Its population tripled during the next few years after Wheeler arrived. Coleman Wheeler already had 10 years of experience working for lumbermen in Michigan, but money was more important than experience. Wheeler brought with him the financial backing of several of his previous employers. When Wheeler moved to the area, he was already familiar with the vast tracts of prime timber along the Nehalem River and its tributaries. Perhaps he knew of an Army Corps of Engineers report that the largest and finest body of timber in Oregon lies adjacent to the Nehalem River along its tributary, the Salmonberry River. No roads or trails led into the hillsides full of trees, but surveyors were laying out the grid, making it possible to settle on or buy land. Lumbermen in Portland closely followed their work. Experienced lumbermen regarded Nehalem Bay an ideal location to receive raw logs and export milled lumber. Logs could float down streams into a mill pond on the bay. Lumber could go by schooner to the booming markets in California. Shortly after he arrived in Nehalem, Wheeler bought land downstream along the east side of the bay. The land already had a small mill operated by Charles Vosburg. Wheeler, Vosburg, and several others upgraded the mill and found men to operate it. Meanwhile, Wheeler and his eastern supporters began buying tracts of land along the Salmonberry, with easy access to the Nehalem. Within a few years, they owned about 70,000 acres of prime Douglas fir and spruce. With upgrades complete, the Vosburg mill along the bay had become big enough to send lumber to California. Wheeler and his partners felt confident enough to form two corporations, the Wheeler Lumber Company and the Nehalem Transportation Company. One would cut trees and make lumber, the other would ship lumber to San Francisco and San Diego. The Articles of Incorporation for the Lumber Company make it clear Wheeler imagined a planned community based around the mill, a popular idea at the time for one-industry towns. The corporation would build houses for employees and control all aspects of logging, from cutting trees to selling lumber. It would also control ownership of land and also services such as electricity, domestic water, and the general store. The first contract of the Nehalem Transportation Corporation went to a shipyard in Astoria to build a barge and steam tug. The two vessels entered operation in 1901 to take lumber from the Vosburg mill. This sturdy tug, also called Vosburg, hauled lumber out of the bay and brought supplies into the bay for 20 years before owners sold it. Near the time of creating the Wheeler Lumber Company, rumors circulated about plans to build a railroad connecting Tillamook County to Portland. Rails had already transformed Newport and Astoria into boom towns, so why not Tillamook? One day we heard the unbelievable rumor of plans to build a railroad between Portland and Tillamook. It couldn't be true. It was too good to be true. People could talk of nothing else. Instead of seasickness, delays, and shipwrecks, imagine sitting in comfort, watching the scenery, and arriving in Portland in only 10 hours. During the next several years, rumor got closer to fact as businessmen assembled financing for the project. Boosters at each end of the proposed tracks pledged support for the project in the form of local tax relief and expanding markets. Businessmen in Tillamook guaranteed the right-of-way almost 40 miles to the county line. Finally, in 1905, surveying and grading got underway. The success of the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland that year had ensured the city's place among cities with glowing futures. Lumbermen from the East had flooded Oregon's Timber Pavilion at the exposition to learn where they could make their next fortune. Meanwhile, North Tillamook County was growing at a rate that would double its population in a few years. What could go wrong? Plenty could go wrong. Cold and snow in the coastal mountains often made work stop. The flourishing shipping and logging industries made railroad workers hard to find and hard to keep. Worries about slow progress made some backers reluctant to continue investing. News of rampant graft in the logging industry made other backers consider stepping away from the project. Finally, the coastal terrain itself presented constant obstacles. Nothing went as planned. Construction from Hillsborough west and from Tillamook north along the two bays proceeded as scheduled, but tunnels and trestles required more time and money than predicted. The route required 11 tunnels cut through the bedrock of the mountains. It also required 9 trestles, where the route crossed rivers and smaller streams. A large trestle might require 1,000,000 board feet of timber. While crews built the railroad, civic leaders in Nehalem revived the idea of jetties at the end of Nehalem Bay. An early report by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had recommended building 2 jetties there to create a safe route between bay and ocean. Outflow between the jetties would scour sand from the bar to ensure a low water depth of 8 feet. By 1909, tired of hoping the Corps of Engineers would build the jetties that its own report had urged 30 years before, local voters formed the Port of Nehalem Special District. The sponsors of the Port District included Coleman Wheeler and several other men from Nehalem. After threatening to build jetties with local money, port commissioners offered to pay half if the Corps would pay the other half. The Corps of Engineers agreed to the deal. Construction of the jetties involved installing pilings and ties to support temporary railroads. Rail cars would carry boulders and machinery to the ends of the growing jetties. After 6 years of work, the bay finally had its jetties. Following news of the railroad and jetties, 2 brothers in Nehalem paid a shipyard in Astoria to build a ferry designed for crossing Nehalem Bay. The Junetta began trips between Nehalem and Wheeler in 1910. The ferry met the train in Wheeler and boarded passengers at the nearby dock before setting off for Nehalem. On busy summer days, it carried extra passengers on its barge. For 15 years, the Junetta ferried passengers and goods across the bay before a road and bridge built in the 1920s made it obsolete. With trains headed for Portland and ships headed for California, investors could expect huge profits from the green gold growing in the mountains. Riches in mind, Wheeler and his partners urged voters to create the city of Wheeler. They also planned another upgrade of the mill, along with housing and services for employees. They quoted Shakespeare at the top of their city map. There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Since the time Coleman Wheeler arrived in the Nehalem Valley, North County population had grown nearly 500%, including construction of 5 hotels, 4 schools, 2 churches, hundreds of feet of docks, wharves, and planked roads, and numerous small businesses and homes. The local market was booming. Boosters commissioned this aerial drawing and claimed, "Wheeler lies in the most wonderfully productive timber country in the United States that the hand of man has not yet touched. The producing country will inevitably pour its wealth into Wheeler, and from Wheeler the fruits of this valley will radiate to the 4 corners of the earth. It is just as impossible to stem the industrial tide which will sweep Wheeler into prominence as a great commercial center as it is to stop the sun in its daily course." To help ensure labor for the mill, and to profit from serving and selling to that labor, Coleman Wheeler located the new city about half a mile upstream from the mill. That location put the town closer to Nehalem while taking advantage of a better waterfront along the tidelands. The railroad had already been built mostly on silt dredged from the bay. The station at the mill was next to the mill pond for delivery of logs from the mountains and freight from Portland. Immediately, the upstream location began to pay off. The Hotel Rector, the town's first building, anchored the main street. The corner of the hotel housed the new post office. A barber shop with baths, a drugstore, and a jeweler rounded out services. Nearby businesses included a cobbler, stove shop, meat store, and print shop. The block south had a pool hall, grocer, bank, lunch counter, and movie theater. Soon, the new school district built an elementary school on a large lot facing the main street. Across the street from the rector, the Columbia Hotel lodged employees from the adjacent fish cannery. On the other side of the cannery, a store advertised ice cream and cigars. A dentist office opened across the street. Bright prospects attracted people to new houses on the hills above the city. A single car like this carried passengers to Tillamook in only 1 hour, meaning they could visit the county seat and return the same day. Along the way, they could meet people from Rockaway, Garibaldi, and Bay City, all growing as fast as Wheeler. By this time, Coleman Wheeler, now almost 50, lived in Portland with his wife and children. Homesteading in North County had ended, and new names appeared among civic and business leadership. The Wheeler Mill began a series of cyclic operations common to the logging industry. It boomed along with the huge markets in California and Portland, and it slowed along with the national economy in 1914 and 1921. It sometimes shut down for local reasons. Once because Charles Du Bois, one of the owners, wanted his own man to run it. Unfortunately, this new manager died shortly after his arrival, and Du Bois had to close the mill for the summer. The mill also closed several times when accidents or weather in the mountains stopped trains from bringing logs. During the Roaring '20s, with a strong national economy and more dependable train service, the mill ran at full production. But when the Depression came in the 1930s, the Wheeler Mill closed permanently. In its heyday, the Wheeler Mill was a complex factory turning logs into lumber. Trains delivered logs into the mill pond at the north end. Conveyors carried the logs as saws trimmed off waste, cut rough lumber, and planed the boards. Green lumber was dried in the shed at the south end. Power for saw operations came from steam. Steam boilers generated the electricity for lighting both the mill and the city. At the height of production, the Wheeler Mill turned out 150,000 board feet of lumber per day, making it one of the largest mills on the West Coast. Across the tracks from the mill, the company had a bunkhouse, mess hall, and general store. Several dozen houses for workers were located up the hill to the east. Many of the houses remain today, and locals still call the area Mill Hill. The ferry Junetta's route included stopping at the mill dock, which was more convenient for employees than the dock uptown. At the other side of town, a smaller lumber mill operated on a landfill between city limits and Botts Marsh. A spruce mill downstream at Brighton added to the prosperity created by the two mills in Wheeler. Only a few minutes away by train, men came from Brighton to drink, dance, and maybe even see a movie. As the area began to grow, boosters advertised Brighton as a sure investment. But a fire in the 1920s closed the Brighton Mill and burned nearby buildings. The Brighton fire was a major loss to the Wheeler economy. Lumber was not the sole driver of the local economy. Nehalem Bay had 4 canneries, including one in Wheeler. Ships from the Elmore Packing Company in Astoria picked up the cases of canned salmon. Shipbuilders designed the vessels to cross the shallow bars along the Oregon coast. The ships also carried passengers and freight from coastal cities to Astoria and Portland. The Wheeler-Gillnet fleet formed a picturesque part of the waterfront until state officials closed commercial fishing in the bay in 1956. Confident of huge profits in the immediate future, real estate salesmen offered lots at what they said were bargain prices. Brochures included aerial drawings such as this for Brighton. Soon after the Wheeler Mill opened, owners contracted with a young doctor from Portland to serve the area. Harvey Reinhardt had recently graduated from medical school when he and his wife Ella moved to Wheeler. A large house on Mill Hill served as their clinic, hospital, and home. Dr. Reinhardt advertised his services for lumber mills in both Wheeler and Brighton, and for the railroad. Harvey Reinhardt served 33 years as the physician for most of North Tillamook County, along the way delivering 566 babies and noting the deaths of 312 patients. In the 1940s, Harvey's son, Dr. Robert Reinhardt, and his wife, Dorothy White, also a physician, joined Harvey in practice. Dr. Harvey had bought the Wheeler Hotel in 1940 to expand his clinic and hospital. When he retired in 1947, his son Robert began looking for space where he and his wife could offer more services. To finance a new building, he urged voters to create a health district with taxing authority. Voters approved the Nehalem Bay Health District in 1951. The Reinhardt Memorial Hospital remained open until 1989, when it closed because more modern medical practices made its services less efficient and more expensive. Problems with the original design of the building's flat roof made rainwater leak into walls. For the next 30 years, tenants moved out while the structure deteriorated. Today, only the food bank remains. The building is doomed to demolition in the near future, taking with it its asbestos flooring, rusty pipes, and sinking foundation. As hospital income fell, district directors built a separate building nearby where several doctors could work. That building was named the Reinhardt Clinic when Harvey Reinhardt's grandson, Harry, arrived as medical director in 1993. Dr. Harry practiced medicine in the clinic which carried the family name until he retired in 2015. The Reinhardt name and medical practice, from Father Harvey to son Robert to grandson Harry, was a vital part of Wheeler for 100 years. After Harry Reinhardt retired, directors of the health district changed the clinic name to Nehalem Bay Health Center. Voters in 2023 approved a bond measure to finance a new clinic and pharmacy on the site of the old schools near downtown Wheeler. The clinic will become the first new building facing the main street since the City Hall opened in 1950. Passenger railroad service, once so important to the area's early development, experienced steady decline. The automobile changed transportation on the coast as it had in other parts of the country. Portland passenger service in the 1920s still ran 3 or 4 times a day on summer weekends and twice a day the rest of the year, but the service wasn't much improved from the early days. Schedules said the train from Portland to Wheeler would take 5 hours, but travelers knew otherwise. One wrote, "The Tillamook Flyer consisted of ancient coaches heated by coal-burning stoves and lighted by kerosene lamps. The seats made no concession to the human spine. The cars were filthy. The baggage car carried sufficient saws and axes and wedges to equip a small logging camp. Passengers had to help buck up trees fallen on the tracks. Ugh. Little wonder the people served by this antiquated train welcomed any mode of transportation that would replace the flyer." Trains continued to carry lumber from mills near Tillamook until a storm in 2007 damaged the tracks beyond repair, but passenger service died with the Depression. During the booming 1920s, Wheeler had almost 800 people. Perhaps it wasn't quite what boosters had promised, but prospects looked good for continued growth. However, when the Depression came, the population fell by half. The sagging economy destroyed visions of a bright future and left the city in a cheerless slump. Another economic blow fell when the Tillamook burn destroyed thousands of acres of prime timber in the Salmonberry Valley. By 1940, the population had fallen by half again to about 200. The 2020 census showed Wheeler's population at 412, about half of what it was 90 years earlier. With mills closed and a location several miles from ocean beaches, Wheeler missed the economic wave of tourism in the 1950s. Some families of patients in the hospital stayed in the small motels, but most residents had to work somewhere else and moved away with their families. The waterfront felt cluttered with old logs and decaying wharves. Fishing boats no longer brightened the scene. The few remaining children now went to school in Rockaway. In 1960, owners closed their grocery store and left town. Demolition caught up with the mill and the schools in the 1960s. The school property stood vacant for 60 years until the health district bought it for the new clinic. The Depression affected the hotel business as much as the logging business. The Rector Hotel had burned down in 1923, and investors built a new fireproof hotel nearby, today known as the Old Wheeler Hotel. It went into foreclosure in 1929. For the next 10 years, absentee owners operated the building as a rooming house. After Dr. Harvey bought it, the hotel remained in the Reinhardt family almost 50 years, until Dr. Dorothy White sold it in 1989. Since then, it has been sold 3 times and operates again as a hotel with commercial services at street level. This photo from 1950 shows the Lewis Shingle Mill at the far left. Moving toward downtown, the Reinhardt Clinic in the hotel building appears at the center of the image. Schools are on the lot now destined for the new health center. The vacant space near the upper right is today's City Park. At the far right, the Reinhardt Memorial Hospital is under construction. Lonely pilings along the waterfront represent abandoned plans to add more fill and build more buildings. At the upper center of this photo, we can see smoke from a wigwam burner belonging to the Lewis Shingle Mill. The mill was built on land created with fill dredged from the bay in the 1930s and 40s. Today, the mill is gone and the land where it stood looks like this. The tidal marsh called Bott's Marsh borders the north side of the filled land. For over 70 years since the schools closed, voters in Wheeler have felt cautious about growth of the city. Controversy over proposals to develop land at the north end of the city represent that caution. In 1984, a developer applied for a permit to create a marina on the 23 acres of land and marsh. The project would have included moorages for fishing boats, services to supply, maintain, and store the boats, and a restaurant. Plans included dredging 270,000 cubic yards into Bott's Marsh, an historic salt marsh, and using 13,000 yards of riprap to build a jetty protecting the marina basin. The entire project would have run about half a mile along the waterfront. One of the developer's arguments for the project focused on the ship Eland, moored on the river 2 miles north of Wheeler. The developer said moving the vessel to the new marina would avoid damage to the highway bridge should a major flood tear the ship from its present location. For 5 years, a maze of state and federal agencies considered the project. Proponents claimed the project would bring tourists, jobs, and economic benefits to the city. Opponents wanted to protect the environment of Bott's Marsh, or were interested in maintaining their views of the bay and preserving Wheeler's quiet, off-the-beaten-path atmosphere. The Lower Nehalem Community Trust now owns Bott's Marsh. The remainder of the property lies vacant. City officials in Wheeler periodically considered development proposals, but by the end of the first quarter of the new century, nothing has been decided. Almost 50 years ago, a Corps of Engineers report noted an absence of community consensus for future uses of the Wheeler waterfront. That judgment still seems accurate. Eventually, someone may develop the prime vacant lot on the waterfront, but in the meantime, Wheeler draws visitors interested in fishing and enjoying the stunning views of Nehalem Bay and Neahkahnie Mountain. Tourist accommodations feature the refurbished Old Wheeler Hotel. Visitors from the valley patronize antique stores and other small businesses. Like many coastal towns built during the heydays of logging, Wheeler residents seek a clear view of their future.